Hey, what's going on, everybody? So today I'm actually going to be doing some of the one of the smaller side characters in what I call the Blongos Network. And first and foremost, as a disclaimer, before I start talking about this gentleman, I want to say that he wasn't. I don't really consider him to be like a part of the network. He was more so just a periphery character who was kind of sucked into the drama of the situation of Ed Wilson and Frank Turple selling C4 to Libya, um, simply because he just knew Ed Wilson. So the gentleman I'm going to be talking about today is actually a person called. Let me pull it up for you. His name is Paul Sear, and he's actually a decorated war hero. So I want to be very sensitive in how I portray and depict him. He served our country bravely in World War II. He is a recipient of, let me see here, the Distinguished Service Cross, and he was actually one of the famous Jedburghs. So if you don't know what a Jedburgh is, those were essentially special forces or special operators who actually parachuted into World War II before the D-Day or before the D-Day invasion or a little bit afterwards. And they basically were doing like sabotage and helping the French resistance, etc., in order to help the Allies invade France or whatnot. So these guys were kind of like the first ones in, kind of, really tough as nails, special forces operators. So I want to be very careful with how I depict him. Because, like I said, even though he's going to get in trouble because of his association with Edwin Wilson, um, for I don't really see a whole lot of other incriminating things about the guy. You know what I'm saying? I think that he just kind of got caught up in the situation with Edwin Wilson in the early 80s. And as a result of a larger federal investigation into Edwin Wilson, he kind of got sucked into it and got in trouble. But before then, I would consider his life to have been, a life of service to his country. So just want to say thank you for your service, and anything that I say about him, particularly to any of his surviving family members, you got to be very sensitive that I'm not trying to tarnish his name, his reputation, etc. So so let me go here, right? So as a kind of a recap of what we've been talking about. So this is the Blonde Ghost Network. Blonde Ghost Network was essentially what I consider to be a rogue faction of the Central Intelligence Agency, in which I strongly believe that a person named Theodore, i.e. Ted Shackley, who was, I think, the Assistant Deputy Director of Operations at the Central Intelligence Agency under William Wells in the mid 1970s. It's my belief that while he was in the CIA, he was working with an ex CIA personnel named Edwin Wilson and another ex CIA person named Frank Turple to essentially sell arms to Libya, but also Egypt, in which Egypt and Libya were actually beefing at the time, so selling arms to both sides. And they actually ended up giving terrorists weapons. And there's a lot of ambiguity as to whether Edwin Wilson had the credo, like the thumbs up from the CIA, or was Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple acting rogue, or some sort of weird combination of both? Who knows, right? You know, a lot of, I hate saying the term because it's kind of cliche at this point, but like four-dimensional chess type moves kind of going on here. But regardless, I have a lot of other videos, and I'm just kind of going through some of the characters here. So today we're talking about Paul Sear, right? So what I've been doing is I kind of just took some notes. So instead of clicking around, I can just kind of do a summary here. Okay, so the Blonde Ghost bio, Paul Sear. He was a Green Mountain boy from Vermont. That's the nickname of just kind of people from Vermont. because of the legend, I want to say, of Ethan Allen, who was a revolutionary hero who led the Green Mountain Boy militia. And interesting fact is that I want to say that the Vermont National Army and Air National Guard still call themselves the Green Mountain Boys. Um, but Paul Sear from Vermont, he was a U.S. Army Office of Strategic Services hero turned lobbyist, right? So that's the general gist of him. So Paul Sear, a World War II veteran at the rank of colonel and former OSS officer from St. Johnsbury, Vermont, became a DC lobbyist with his firm Paul Sear Associates. He was of a French-American family with military ties. In World War II, Sear parachuted into occupied France in 1944 with orders to arm members of the resistance. Having outwitted the Germans and the Gestapo, a year later, Sear found himself in China, where he led an OSS team that blew up a railway bridge over the Yellow River. He had won the Distinguished Service Cross on Jedburgh Team George. Later, he was a chief lobbyist for the Army Material Command in the 60s and the 70s and became director of congressional relations at the Federal Energy Administration, which later became the Department of Energy. I have administrator written out, but I meant to say administration. Actually, I can correct that real quick. Like I said, these are just general notes that I'm just kind of taking. Okay. So he was later referred to by the Justice Department. So this is where things start getting sticky. He was later referred to by the Justice Department to be indicted in a bribe scandal because of Edwin Wilson, in which Wilson tried to buy political influence for many of his CIA shell companies. He was laid to rest in 1994 as in Sear. It is possible as a Jedburgh, so this is me just kind of speculating based on the other kind of fascinating OSS CIA history that I'm into. So it is possible as a Jedburgh, he could have known General John K. Singlaub, who was actually later incriminated in the Iran Contra Scandal. And possibly even Lucien Cognier is actually E before the I, who later ran covert operations for the DEA. And I want to say he led the precursor to the DEA, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the FBN, and this Lucien Cognier person was highly active in clandestine operations in the Vietnam War. Um, so Lucien Cognier and John K. Singlaub were also Jedburghs, notably John K. Singlaub. And interestingly, Lucien Cognier, when he was in the army and working for the OSS, he was in occupied France, and he was actually working with the Corsican mob. And those Corsican mob connections would come in handy later, maybe for some would speculate for nefarious reasons, such as the CIA being aware and possibly of facilitating the shipment of heroin out of Southeast Asia. So these connections that Kanye had with the Corsican mob, of course, had very strong connections in French Indochina. So it'd be like Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, things of that nature, right? And the French connection is actually kind of tied to that whole um, drug smuggling operation. And as a side note, for people who are listening and are interested, there is a good book by Professor, I think his name is Douglas Porch, of the U.S. Naval War College, and he wrote a book on the French Secret Service. I want to say it's just simply called the French Secret Service, in which he goes into pretty good detail about how the French essentially blew Indochina, famous battles like Dien Bien Phu, but also the reliance of the French colonial powers on opium plantations, and how when the French got essentially defeated, they still had a presence in Vietnam, a clandestine one, but the Americans essentially took over many of those, I hate to say it, opium producing operations, because the opium producing operations were helping to create, potentially, allegedly, slush funds for traceless, money, so that the CIA could better, fund guerrilla revolutionaries and stuff like that. to fight communism across the globe. So is this very interesting, right? That you have, you know, Paul Sear, who was a Jedburgh, also alongside people like John K. Singlaub and Lucien Cognier, who are two former OSS Army, legendary spooks. Um, and it's just fascinating how even the Blonde Ghost Network overlaps a lot of the Vietnam stuff, and how both of those overlap with a lot of the Iran Contra stuff. It's just all fascinating, all kind of connects with each other, to be honest with you, and a lot of the Bay of Pigs stuff, right? Because we got to be real, is that figures such as um, Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, Thomas Clines. These guys were around and active during the Bay of Pigs invasion. And they actually got to know many Cuban Americans who they were training for the Cuban invasion. And many of those Cubans actually became assets being handled by case officers like Thomas Clines afterwards. And these Cubans played an important role in clandestine operations themselves, and including political assassinations, assisting in CIA operations in Congo, and then also being incriminated with characters like Rafael Quintero being incriminated in the 1980s in Iran Contra scandal in Nicaragua, in which allegedly figures like Rafael Quintero, who I'm going to go into later in a video just about the Cubans involved, was seen by witnesses helping to ship cocaine to South Florida or whatnot in the whole drugs for guns kind of racket that was helping to assist the Contras, because Oliver North was running out of money from his also illegal um, Iran arms deal for hostages sort of situation. So it's all kind of interwoven, right? So so now let's get back here, right? So let's me just kind of keep reading here. So that's a little background, right? And all right, so let's reread this one right here. So this is a source from the UPI archives from September 12th, 1981. Federal investigators have sent to the Justice Department to ... source yada yada. Okay, so the quote from this source is: the Bureau agents in investigative case summary said Wilson and Turple are known to bribe U.S. government officials to enhance their businesses, as evidenced by Paul Sear referral in the William Wiesenberger referral. The Post said referral means cases sent to the Justice Department for possible prosecution, right? So as a heads up, if you don't, so I'm gonna do it. I gotta do another video on William, i.e., Bill Wiesenberger. He was actually one of the supervisors in like the technical services division of the CIA, i.e., the people who do a lot of the dirty tricks and make a lot of like the props and explosives and everything like that. William Wiesenberger was later fired by General or Admiral Stansfield Turner for his association with Edwin Wilson. And Wiesenberger actually was kind of involved in overseeing some of the detonators and timers being actually shipped to Gaddafi for a terrorist training camp. Okay, so within the same UPI article, another quote is: the Post identified Sear, age 60, as former chief congressional lobbyist for the Army Material Command during the 1960s and 1970s, who later held a similar position with the defunct Federal Energy Administration, and then became Deputy Director of Congressional Relations for the FEA's successor agency, the Department of Energy. The investigative report did not detail the bribery allegations, the Post said, but several sources familiar with the investigation told the Post that the allegations involved alleged payments to Sear to protect and promote Wilson's interests at a time when Wilson was trying to maintain his influence on Capitol Hill. There is no evidence Sear knew anything about Wilson's Libyan activities, the Post said. So that's very important there, and that's why I wanted to have that disclaimer at the beginning, is because you know I don't think that Sear did not have anything to do with the Libya stuff. However, he was guilty of kind of kickbacks for favors, taking those from Wilson because Wilson was infamous and known and very skilled at creating shell companies for the CIA, particularly in Edwin Wilson's earlier CIA career, in which he was promoted from the Office of Security in his early tenure when he entered the CIA, but he was promoted into the clandestine services, and that's where he actually met Thomas Clines, who was his supervisor. And the clandestine services, of course, are the ones who do a lot of the paramilitary stuff, a lot of the spying, human intelligence stuff, right? And Wilson, one of his jobs was maritime logistics. So he would create a lot of like a shell third party logistics freight forwarding companies for the agency for them to essentially get goods where they needed to be, when they needed to be, where they needed to be. Um, so there's kind of about that, right? So regardless, Sear was not really involved in the Libya stuff, but he was by proxy involved with Wilson. So there is another source from 1981 by Patrick E. Tyler and Al Kamen, Federal Bureau Investigation, Justice Department sent bribery redacted. So I think I got that from the CIA. So that is from the actual CIA.gov reading room. So let me just read some quotes here. So in part, to further these alleged efforts, the confidential report continues. They, Wilson and Turple, are also known to bribe U.S. government officials to enhance their businesses, as evidenced by the Paul Sear referral and the William Wiesenberger referral. Referral means that the cases are sent to the Justice Department for further investigation and possible prosecution. Sear 60, a longtime Capitol Hill fixture in lobbying circles, was the chief congressional liaison for the Army Material Command. So we already know that, so no need to read any further into that quote. I was just trying to organize all my sources and everything. So here's an interesting thing about Sear as a person. So Sear, an avid sportsman, redacted, hunting partners included several congressmen, distinguished himself for behind the lines commando experience in World War II, where he served in the Office of Strategic Services, a predecessor of the CIA. The investigative report does not go into detail about the bribery allegations, but several sources familiar with the investigation said they concerned alleged payments to Sear to protect and promote Wilson's interests at a time when Wilson was trying to maintain his influence at Capitol Hill, in support of highly classified intelligence projects and other ventures involving the string of companies he ran out of his offices at 1425 K Street Northwest. There is no indication in the report that Sear knew anything about Wilson's Libyan activities. So from another UPI article in 1982, titled Paul Sear, a former official of Federal Energy, ... So, Washington. Paul Sear, a former official of the FEA, has pleaded guilty to charges of accepting a bribe from Edwin Wilson, the former intelligence agent in custody, on charges of illegally shipping explosives to Libya, the government said Wednesday. An aide to the Assistant U.S. Attorney Carol Bruce said Sear entered the plea in U.S. District Court Judge John Pratt Tuesday. The aide said Sear, now 61, pleaded guilty to one count of agreeing to receive a gratuity and one count of receiving a gratuity. The offenses each carry a sentence of up to 2 years in prison, a $10,000 fine, or both. Pratt set no date for sentencing, and his office said it will probably will not come by the end of the summer. The charges involve Sears dealing with ex-CIA agent Wilson, now in federal custody, on charges he illegally exported explosives to Libya. Wilson was apprehended last month. The government said the bribe was for help Sear provided Wilson in 1977 in getting a federal contract for Data Financial Systems Inc., a Washington-based firm. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Wilson told one of his employees Sear was to get $3,000 to $6,000 for his help, and Sear picked up the money with an unnamed associate at Wilson's former business, Consultants International, in December 1977. That's very interesting. Consultants International is very important because that was like the flagship shell company that Wilson created. Actually, I want to say back in like the late 50s or 60s, with the help of notable DC lobbyists, like I think his name is Robert Smith Gray, I think was one of his names. Let me see here. Robert Keith Gray, excuse me. So, um, so Consultants International was definitely a spook CIA company, but that was definitely one of the flagships of Wilson. So Sear, a retired Army colonel, was a longtime Capitol Hill lobbyist and was in charge of congressional relations for the Army Material Command, and later took a job with the Department of Energy. Um, Sear, who now has his own consulting firm, Sear Paul Associates or Paul Sear Associates, reportedly agreed to cooperate with authorities in the government's investigation of Wilson. He joins a list of others who have agreed to cooperate with the government in its investigations of Wilson. So you got to think too. Is that the feds, they're going to find if they're trying to build a case against Wilson, so they need to get I hate to say it, they need to get as many people in his periphery in trouble so they can create deals and actually become witnesses and help them build their case. Right? That seems how the feds work. So in January, Douglas Schlachter, indicted in August 1981 on charges of illegally shipping explosives to Libya, agreed to cooperate with the government. He pleaded guilty of 2 counts of criminal conduct arising from his work with Wilson. In return for his cooperation as a witness, the other charges in the indictment were dropped. So Douglas Schlachter is actually a very important character who I also have notes on, who I need to do an individual video on, because he was kind of like a supervisor for the Libyan terrorist training camp that Wilson and Turple were creating for Gaddafi's regime. And regardless, so Wilson was arrested on June 15th at Kennedy Airport in New York following an international manhunt and held in lieu of $20 million bail. All right, so pretty much there's that. Actually, I want to copy and paste this real quick. Copy this real quick. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to take a quick break. All right, so back at it. So this is actually one of the documents that I read on the CIA.gov's reading room. This is open to the public. As a disclaimer, nothing that I'm saying here is really new. It's just I think for a lot of people in my generation, elder millennials at this point, Zoomers and Gen whatever Alpha or whatever, they don't really know a lot about this. So it's just kind of interesting history, right? Um, so there's that article for proof. And I'll probably just close that out right now. This is the UPI article that I kind of referenced there. So interesting so this is actually from militarytimes.com, Hall of Valor by militarytimes.com. So that's a picture of for some reason they said Roger Sear here, but up here is Paul Sear, so maybe his name is Paul Robert Sear, I don't know, but he goes by Paul Sear, we know that for a fact. So like I said, a very dapper gentleman, kind of looks like Captain America, for the most part. So let me read this. So Sear was a member of an elite international unit including 82 Americans that parachuted into France, Belgium, and Holland ahead of Allied armies on or after D-Day to organize resistance. These special operators were codenamed Jedburghs. So that's the distinguished cross that he got, service cross. So for date of action, June 9th to August 25th, 1944. So interesting. So headquarters, European Theater of Operations, U.S. Army General Order number 116, November 15th, 1944. So this is kind of reading out his commendation or his award. So the President of the United States of America takes pleasure in presenting the Distinguished Service Cross to Captain Infantry Paul Sear, ASN 0-1286-091, United States Army, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving with Jedburgh Team George, Office of Strategic Services, in action against enemy forces behind enemy lines from 9 June 1944 through 25 August, showing complete disregard for his own life and courageous solicitude for the lives of his men. Captain Sear destroyed several enemy trucks which were bringing up reinforcements. Although he knew that such actions jeopardized his own escape on 2 occasions, Captain Sear guided to safety American and British pilots untrained and operating on the ground behind enemy lines and gave them instructions to facilitate their return to England. Although Captain Sear knew that the Gestapo had an accurate description of him and were searching for him relentlessly, he continued his work in the Lior Inferior, realizing its strategic importance in the United States Army. When Captain Sear received from a member of the underground the German plans for the defense of the coast of Loire Inferior, including the important port of Saint Nazaire, he insisted he himself take the risk of delivering them through the German lines. He handed them over to the Assistant Chief of Staff G2 Headquarters 7 Corps. Receiving orders from the Army commander, he returned through German lines to deliver them to the resistance groups and to stay with them to see that everything possible was done for the U.S. Army. Captain Sear's extraordinary heroism, personal bravery, and zealous devotion to duty exemplify the highest traditions of the military forces of the United States and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. Wow. So, geez, so not only did he get French resistance intel about German defensive positions on the coast behind enemy lines. So he's going back and forth between enemy lines, basically giving information to the Allied headquarters, basically, and to the resistance fighters. But then he was also helped to save, American and British pilots who were also behind enemy lines as well. So this is definitely some like SEER level special forces. Was it survival, escaped, resistance, and evasion, SEER type stuff? Um, stuff that he was doing. So, pretty badass. And like I said, you got to be very careful because, he honorably served his country or whatnot. Unfortunately, just later on in life, he got, caught up in the whole DC lobbying crowd. But, there's forgiveness and everything like that. He was, got in trouble for it. And if anything, his cooperation with the feds helped bring down Wilson, who was pretty much just operating his own shadow state. Um, so it's very interesting, right? It's like you can almost just do a movie about just Singlaub and Kanye and Sear and just I'm sure there's even more OSS Jedburgh veterans and everything like that who just have a very fascinating history on the peripheries of like power in the DC area and all that type of stuff, right? So there's that. There's also something I'm going to put in the link for you, and it's actually from the University of Southern Maine, which actually has about five MP3 files of audio files in an interview with Paul Sear, and this was done by Michael G. Hillard of the University of Southern Maine. So pretty cool, you know. So I'm gonna put that over there. I downloaded one of them, so I'll probably play that. Um, so I'll probably play that at the end of the video. So let me see here. So interesting, right? So I'm just reading into this. So this Southern Maine University, University of Southern Maine discussion. So the abstract is a key part of Paul Sear interview was the events of the 1971 strike against Fraser. Rold was a young militant union and Democrat Party activist in the 70s, and then inspected mostly paper mills in the early years after he left the mill in 1978. So it's like, it almost kind of seems that he was also involved in some sort of like union sort of activity as well, lobbying or something. So because more to come on that. But what's interesting is as I'm looking at this page, it is actually talking about paper mills. So you got to think that part of the country, Maine, everything, a lot of lumber mills and all that type of stuff. So it seems like Paul Sear must have did some sort of lobbying for potentially a company called Fraser Paper Company as well. So that's just some random more stuff to kind of piece together who he is as a person. Um, so I'm going to skip to this one here. So this actually is going to give us some photos of who he actually looks like. And as that's loading, I'm going to take a quick break. Okay, so this is very interesting. So this is actually from the Rutland Herald, which is up in Vermont, I want to say. Or it's being shared, or it was originally published on the Rutland Herald, but it's being shared by the Bar Montpelier Times Argus. So some newspapers from up in Vermont. So I'm gonna blow this up for you here. So very interesting. So that's right here as I'm circling. That is Paul Sear actually. Looks like he's about to do parachute jump actually. So behind enemy lines, pretty interesting. What's interesting is that the gentleman right next to him actually looks maybe like uh, Asian or whatnot, which was not uncommon. There was actually many, there was a lot more diversity than I think we give credit in World War II. You have many African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, many Japanese Americans, all serving, helping the Allied forces for their country, the United States. So it's very interesting and fascinating. So that's a photo right there. Or actually, this might be in China. I wouldn't be surprised because it looks like some of the people in here might also be Chinese. So we'll see. So we know that he, PJ'd into Europe and into China. So let me read this, right? So this is St. Johnsbury native served as secret agent by Bruce Edwards, Rutland Herald, January 5th, 2009, updated October 27th, 2018. So it's the kind of stuff you'd find in a good spy novel. But St. Johnsbury native Paul Sear not only lived the life of a secret agent and saboteur during World War II, but lived to tell the tale twice. A member of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency, Sear parachuted into occupied France in 1944 with orders to arm members of the resistance. Having outwitted the Germans and the Gestapo, a year later Sear found himself in China, where he led an OSS team that blew up a railway bridge over the Yellow River, a mission he recounted in the Saturday Evening Post. Sear's journey from St. Johnsbury High School student to wartime saboteur began in 1938 when he joined the 43rd Division of the National Guard. When the Guard was activated prior to Pearl Harbor, Sear volunteered for the paratroopers but broke his leg in a practice jump. Undeterred, he volunteered for the OSS because he wanted to raise hell with the enemy. While training troops at Fort Blanding, Florida, in the fall of 1943, his application to join General William Wild Bill Donovan's cloak and dagger service was accepted. Like many combat veterans, Sear never shared much about his wartime experience. Even his even with his family. His son, Tom Sear, said over the years he only gleaned bits and pieces about his dad's life as a spy and saboteur. If you ask him directly, he will respond to you, but otherwise, no, he wouldn't volunteer information, said Tom Sear, who lives in Arizona. Sear's story can be pieced together from his family, books about the OSS, declassified documents, and his first person account in the Saturday Evening Post. We blew the Yellow River Bridge. Members of the OSS underwent months of specialized training as well as extensive background checks before being sent overseas on their mission. Sear was assigned to a Jedburgh team based in England. The Jedburghs were three-member teams comprised of American, British, and French operatives who were dropped behind German lines. Their mission was a combination of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and arranging airdrops of arms and supplies for the French resistance. The name of the Jedburgh is unclear. There is a Scottish town of Jedburgh. Then again, the name may have been randomly chosen from a list of codenames. As a member of Jedburgh Team George, Sear, a captain, and two French officers parachuted into the Redan area of Brittany on the night of June 9th, 1944. Their mission, according to the declassified OSS report, was to assist the British Special Airborne Service Commando Team in establishing a base of operations. To that end, George was to enlist the help of the local resistance and to arrange for airdrops of arms and supplies. The declassified report contains several pages of wireless radio dispatches for behind enemy lines to London headquarters. The first coded report is dated June 11th, 1944, 5 days after the D-Day landing along the Normandy coast. 4,000 partisans must receive 100 Brens, 1,000 Stens, 1,000 battle dress. Situation hot. Will explode if arms not received. Contacted Ferdinand. Send him previous request. Urgent. Has lost everything. Need 1 million francs. Please, we beg you send equipment. On June 18th, there was a dispatch. Marquis of the Resistance, very important but badly organized and without arms. Zone strategically important to assure cutting lines of communication. Brittany and ensure supply operations. Morbihan. So I think that's a town in France. So we are traveling in civilian clothes in Gestapo auto. Actually, let me do something here real quick. I'm actually going to a little piece of paper. This is some fascinating stuff. And take some notes. Alright, so that town was Morbihan. Wow. So we were traveling in civilian clothes in Gestapo auto. We will keep liaison with SAS. SAS able to arm Marquis sufficiently. Between June 18th and 25, the SAS base at Diensen was attacked by heavy German forces, but Sear and his team escaped. Jeez. It wouldn't be the last time the Vermont native escaped capture. Sear, who spoke French, could mingle among the civilian population. His fake French identity card bore his photo and the name Paul Louis Cartier. On the morning of June 28th, German forces attacked Team George and the resistance members at a farm in the village of Safre. The following after-action report describes in part the encounter. As Jerry machine gun fire started, I think that's what they call the Germans. As Jerry machine gun fire started to register on our headquarters and men were being hit, the confusion was terrific. At the Marquis, we had found 3 American and 2 British pilots who were at this time with us. The group we led numbered from about 40 to 50 people. As we left the farm, an FM gunner was killed. Captain Sin took the gun and carried it to another position, where soon German trucks pulled up within 15 yards. Before the Germans can get out, he emptied 3 remaining magazines into their jury trucks, this being the last of our ammunition. Later, in the village of La Roche Blanche, partisans provided Team George with a safe house and a place to hide their wireless radio. Following an Allied air attack on a nearby train, the village was overrun by German troops. Wow. So while the police and milice, i.e., collaborators, were searching through the public places and houses, Captain Cyr and Lejeune hid in a small room of the Hotel Martin, according to the classified Team George report. On another occasion, some excitement was caused by some countrymen discovering entirely by accident our radio and equipment, which had hidden in a ruined chapel. As we were packing up to move to another area, a Gestapo car drove up to the crossroad outside the door of our house. We could do nothing but stand on each we could do nothing but stand on each side of the door, our fingers on the trigger. In his book, The Jedburghs, author and former U.S. Special Forces veteran Lieutenant Colonel Will Irwin uh, described another close call at a restaurant on the Lord. I need a Lior. I'm just gonna say Lior River. I'm gonna write that book down too. So the Jedburghs by Will Irwin. All right. So one day, however, Captain Cyr got into an argument with a Luftwaffe lieutenant, and the man again worried about the American accent. This sounds very much like Inglorious Bastards, doesn't it? The scene with Michael Fassbender, even though he plays a British commando with a fake German accent. So after that, Cyr wrote a bandage over his mouth, and the 2 French Jedburghs told everyone that he had been wounded. This kept people from trying to get Cyr to talk, but it also made it difficult for him to eat. So during his several months in France, um, perhaps Cyr's most valuable contribution was passing on German fortification plans on the Brittany coast, including a U-boat base at Saint Nazaire to General George Patton's Third Army. With the help of a member of the resistance, Cyr made his way through German lines to Third Army headquarters in Normandy, where the plans were turned over to Patton. Cyr also got help in turn. Team George had been out of radio contact with London, so Patton's headquarters arranged for a large airdrop of money, arms, and supplies to the partisans. On Friday night, August 11th, the parachute drop from London came. 25 bombers arrived over the Lior Inferior and dropped nearly 600 containers filled with 71 tons of arms and supplies, Edwin wrote in the Jedburghs. Overnight, the Marquis battalions, organized by Jedburgh Team George, became much stronger. Cyr and Team George made a second mission to France in September 1944, working with other Jedburgh teams and with the Free French Forces of the Interior, or FFI, in an area of La Rochelle and Saint Nazaire. So the next stop, so actually let me pause real quick. So that's his time in France. Okay, so now I'm back. So part two of the article, St. Johnsbury native served as secret agent. So now the second part is going to be about Paul Cyr in China. All right. So next job, let me blow this up a little bit more. Okay. So next stop, China Cyr's job as secret agent and saboteur wasn't over. Having survived the Germans, the OSS sent Cyr, now a major, to fight the Japanese in China. In a story reminiscent of the 1957 movie The Bridge on the River Kwai, Cyr was put in charge of an OSS team to arm and train Chinese guerrillas. Their objective was blowing a railway bridge over the Yellow River near Kafing in central China. Think about that. So he was put in charge of an OSS team to arm and train Chinese guerrillas, not the nationalists, the guerrillas, right? And this kind of gets a little ominous here because, um, actually, never mind. So this is still in 1944. No, no, no. Yeah, so a little bit afterwards. Actually, 1 minute. I'm gonna take a pause. I gotta look up something. All right. So the reason why I took a little pause there was because it looks like we're reading this article here. So it says next stop China. Okay, so let me keep reading here. So Cyr was put in charge of an OSS team to arm and train Chinese guerrillas. Their objective was blowing a railway bridge over the Yellow River near Kafing in central China. On May 22nd, 1945, Cyr and Team Jackal parachuted 350 miles behind the Japanese lines. Okay, so the war is still rallying on in Asia with the Japanese. Okay, this was the first time anybody had tried to parachute into enemy territory from this base. And what the pilots knew of this target didn't fill them with happiness and confidence. Cyr recounted in We Blew the Yellow River Bridge, which appeared in March 23rd, 1946 edition of the Saturday Evening Post. Uh, so the hottest so the hottest anti-aircraft fire in all the China, Burma, India theater had been reported around the Yellow River Bridge. There were 1,500 Japanese at the northern end with plenty of guns. There were guns along the bridge, and there were more Japanese at the south end. Cyr and his team dropped into enemy territory without detection, but one of the team members suffered a broken ankle, and the canister containing their weapons was smashed on impact, leaving the men armed with only pistols. Wow. Avoiding detection by the Japanese often required imagination. In making arrangements to fly his comrade with the broken ankle out of China, Cyr passed under the very eyes of the enemy, hidden inside a horse-drawn bride's cart. So, armed with two pistols, Cyr made his way past the Japanese. Cyr's mission required the training of Chinese partisans. I trained 35 men for rails and 25 men for bridges, Cyr wrote. We made 1,000 rail charges of TNT and made many more with Chinese gun cotton with old wicks for fuses when we ran out of our own material. The 3 Mile bridge across the Yellow River was considered a key target to disrupt Japanese troop and supply movements. On the night of August 9th, 1945, Sears Team Jackal and their Chinese allies set their plan in motion. Soon after dark on August 9th, our rivermen crawled down through the grass of the hidden boats and loaded the demolition charges aboard with 100-foot fuses, which would burn even underwater for 25 minutes, Sear wrote. He continued, agile as monkeys, and the saboteurs swarmed up the bridge supports, passing 72 packets of explosives from one to another quickly and noiselessly. The fuses were lit, and Sear and his team waited. We didn't have an electric detonator for exact timing, but we got the train just the same. It puffed onto the bridge just as we reached the bank. The locomotive was almost across when all hell broke loose. 6 cars crumbled, and the locomotive slid back into the hole where the inshore pier had been. The other cars were stopped right over another mine pier. So the other cars were stopped right over another mine pier in perfect position. Japanese soldiers were everywhere, 19 carloads of them. As they screamed and scolded and asked questions about the delay, the second charge went off, then another and another. The rest of the train, the soldiers, and that whole section of bridge vanished into the swirling river. The number of Japanese dead as a result of Sears' action was estimated at 1,800. On the same day the bridge was blown, the second atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese homeland, destroying the city of Nagasaki. Sears' wife, Donna, recalled her husband as being fearless, loyal, and imbued with a lot of perseverance. Married in 1943, she said that her husband kept much of his wartime adventures secret. He really did not talk about that much, said Donna Sear, herself a veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, the post-war successor of the OSS. So he found out about reading the Saturday Evening Post and reading Esquire. The very so wow. So we found out about reading the Saturday Evening Post and reading Esquire. The very fact that Sear survived the war still impresses his son, Tom Sear. He didn't have much fear, I'll tell you. He said, "You can't do any more than risk your life." He fully expected to die in France, let alone China. Tom Sear also recalled how his father escaped the clutches of the Gestapo, which placed a bounty on his head in hopes a French collaborator would turn him in. Sears' heroism on two fronts wasn't forgotten. He was recognized by the French government, which awarded him the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. From his own country, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. The village of La Rose Blanche didn't forget Sear and Team George either. While he was holed up in the ruins of Saint Michel Chapel, Sear etched these words that were uncovered at the end of the war. Mother God, pray for us, protect us, and give us the necessary strength to accomplish our mission. It was signed PC, alias Paul Louis Cartier, American captain officer. In 1990, Sear returned to La Roche Blanche to be honored by the village that sheltered him. His wife and family were guests of honor at a 1995 ceremony at a year after Sear's death. For his service in China, Sear received the Bronze Star for meritorious service. In 1975, the Republic of China conferred upon him the Order of Cloud and Banner. Following the war, Sear moved to Gary, Indiana, the hometown of his wife. He entered politics, losing a bid for a congressional seat. For a time, he worked as an aide to Senator Homer Capehart, Republican, Indiana, and then took a job with the Federal Energy Administration. He maintained ties to his former OSS colleagues, including CIA Director William Colby and General John Singlaub. He died at his retirement home in South Carolina in 1994 at the age of 73. Sear was one of two native Vermonters to serve in OSS. The other was Steve Cisco of Springfield, who served behind enemy lines in Thailand. Wow. Isn't that an amazing story? Wow, that's an amazing story. Wow, that is really, really cool. Like, regardless of all the Blonde Ghost Network stuff or whatever, like, that in itself, is just, like, all his accomplishments, that's crazy. Like, wow. Awesome, awesome piece, too. So, I'm going to take a break. There's some good notes in here, but let me see here. And isn't that so interesting? Like I said, a lot of those OSS Jedburghs and people like that went off, that most of them, because they were almost like early, before the Green Berets were established, what these Jedburghs were doing was effectively that. And John K. Singlaub is actually one of the fathers of, U.S. Army Special Forces and one of the founding members of the CIA. So essentially, you know, direct action, political action, paramilitary action, what have you. A lot of these army guys in airborne or whatever laid the groundwork for what the CIA would later utilize from special forces going forward in conflicts like Vietnam, etc. Um, so very fascinating stuff. So I'm going to take a quick break and we will be back. Okay, so back. And what's interesting is there's actually a LinkedIn thing about Paul Sear. So let me blow this up for you a little bit. So so it's called Paul Sear OSS Operations in Occupied France in 1944 and China in 1945, by David Phillips, adjunct professor at the RAND Corporation, published April 27th, 2024. So Paul Sear not only lived the life of a secret agent and saboteur during World War II, but lived to tell the tale twice. A member of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency, Sear parachuted into occupied France in 1944 with orders to arm resistance members of the resistance. Having outwitted the Germans and the Gestapo, a year later, Sear found himself in China where he led an OSS team that blew up a railway bridge over the Yellow River. So that's actually a photo of him. Kind of see him as a young man and everything. So there's him there. And it looks like he has the oak cluster on his lapel. So I think this is by the time he is a major, which means he probably would have been in China or Asia, maybe even possibly by that time. So OSS Washington makes a practice of interviewing returnees regarding their experiences in the field for the purpose of taking advantage of such experiences in future operations. The following is an interview with Major, then Captain Paul Sear of 817 Grant Avenue, Gary, Indiana. So Paul Sear is very young in appearance, a Vermonter with a background of an old and famous French military family. Which is side note, so the French military academy is called Saint Cyr, I believe. So I'm not sure if there's a relation or anything to that or whatnot. So so he is young enough, for example, to get excited as he talks. The cynicism and reserve generally attributed to the older men are not for him. He calls a spade, and in describing it calls attention to the fact that it is a bloody spade. In telling of his experience, his voice takes on a dramatic quality, and he acts out the incidents as he goes along. This is kind of a picture of him right there. So he is 23, so this is an old interview. So Paul Sierre went into France twice. The first time into Brittany immediately after D-Day until 24th of August. The second time he went back on the 7th of September to stay until the end of November. He and his team of two in a British team set off in a Sterling bomber pinpointed on a perfect signal and landed among 200 members of a reception committee whose chief armament appeared to be, according to the captain, jackknives and slingshots. So on his way down, he was a little worried by a group of 15 men running towards him. They hit him as he landed, swarming all over him, tearing at his harness and waving knives. His fears were dissipated, however, when he realized that they were enthusiastic friends rather than ferocious enemies. They were merely seeking to get him free of his shoe. One of the first things to strike the captain outside his overly cordial reception committee was the fact that the whole thing seemed to be so informal and casual. Members of the committee would yell to their friends on the outskirts of the field and generally make no effort to conceal their presence. The rejoicing at times reminded him of a football celebration. Amid cheers, the operatives were chaired by the French and borne triumphantly off to a farmhouse which was used as headquarters. So, but what about security? The captain wanted to know. Where are the Germans? To which the French, pausing in their business of firing off a volley by the way of celebration, replied, "Oh, they're almost a mile away." This kind of thing scared the captain to death, he says. Another instance of the inherent childishness and enthusiasm of the Marquis came when supplies were dropped by planes. So the Marquis is, this is me talking, is just another code word for the French resistance. So the discovery of each container prompted the French to start right away a punitive expedition against the Nazis. The OS men, trying desperately to build up a backlog of supplies, were greatly tied by were greatly tried by this overeagerness. The captain and his team were to form, train, and supply commando units and lead them into harassing actions against the Germans. So this is a side note. So this is what separates Green Berets from Rangers. So both are considered special forces, but Green Berets are more for your kind of individual operator behind, like more clandestine training paramilitaries, things of that nature. Whereas Rangers are more of like a uniform shock force, shock troops kind of thing to get things done or whatnot. So Green Berets typically are kind of like your lone wolf assassin type people who can also train clandestine irregulars and stuff like that. So problems beset them at once. Apparently, no radio had been dropped. Word was sent out to scour the area cautiously for the sets. Next morning, French farmers came in driving their wagons bearing radios. Seems they had been dropped and scattered over a radius of 5 miles by misdirection. Later, the captain discovered that the pilot had completely forgotten about dropping the radios, had flown almost back to London, then turned around and came all the way back. Due to lack of signals, however, he got the equipment scattered all over the place. Sears' first contact with a German came the following day. He, the German, was brought in by the Frenchman driving the bakery cart and was quite dead. As soon as word of the successful drop got out, recruits began to swarm in on the farmhouse. Hundreds and hundreds of Marquis came to get their guns, their ammunition, and their training. Word would come into the headquarters that a truck loaded with Nazis was a mile down the road, and right away a squad would set off to wipe them out. Trouble with this behavior was that it could not help but call attention to the fact that a formidable store of munitions and men were in the vicinity. The SAS men, who had come in with specific demolition objectives, also went into action. They blew bridges and ambushed Germans with abandon. It would only be a question of time before the Germans mounted their own punitive expedition. Meanwhile, the captain, besides trying to restrain With reason, the enthusiasm of the Marquis and the SAS, the Special Airborne Service, was contacting local Marquis chiefs and trying to repair the radios so that a signal could be put through to London. In 15 days of comparative quiet, the team was able to arm and equip 5,000 Marquis with Bren guns, bazookas, stins, grenades, and pistols. It was now the 19th of June. The continent had been invaded, and all hell was starting with the Germans. But some training had been affected. It was limited, and it was not always successful. The French, in their eagerness to learn, would cause a gun to go off accidentally or pull a pin from a grenade and let it go, tossing it over their shoulders. There were more French killed by French in the fortnight than by Germans, according to Cyr. The captain saw the security regulations were tightened up for the area, but occasional skirmishes indicated that the Nazis were suspicious and constantly probing in larger patrols to get information. In addition, it could not be concealed that large numbers of planes were flying over the area dropping supplies. One night, for example, 30 planes came over dropping 6 jeeps, all completely armed with machine guns. The arrival of the jeep seemed to set off the main fireworks at 6 a.m. the next morning. What proved to be a fateful day began. A jeep with Special Air Service men in it ran into a German armored patrol, Feldgendarme. The jeep reacting on the SAS men like Benzradine. So the jeep reacted on the SAS men like Benzradine, prompted them to challenge the patrol and capture it. Accordingly, one of them hopped out and walked right up to the enemy, threatened them with their pistols, and demanded to get their hands up. Much to everyone's surprise, the Germans did just that, except all but one, who made a move for his gun. The SAS man fired his pistol and discovered that he had forgotten to load it. Just one of those things, says Captain. The darndest things happen in the heat of the moment. In a second, the Germans were in a ditch firing madly, and another party of Marquis coming up the road opened up with one of the newly arrived Bren guns, firing indiscriminately, killing many of the jeep party as well as the Germans. Eventually, the German patrol was decimated except for one man. He escaped. Trouble started. At 9 a.m., 200 Nazis returned to march through the local village and pick hostages. These hostages were carefully marched ahead of their columns as they came down the road. The Marquis lay in wait along the road and opened fire on the flanks. In this way, the column was stopped and the hostages unharmed. The Nazis began a retreat, and there was a brisk battle for an hour during which they were surrounded. By setting the fields afire with tracer bullets, they managed to retreat back to the village, escaping in the smoke, calling promptly for reinforcements. At 2 p.m., several battalions of Nazi paratroopers appeared. They were crack troops, says the captain. They were wild men, fighting without regard for losses. One position after another, our men were wiped out. The Marquis held well, much better than had been expected for the men fighting with new equipment and little training. They were chiefly equipped with enthusiasm, unfortunately, and the Nazis not only matched this, but threw the best of years of training to supplement. By 3:30 p.m., the Nazi battalion has surrounded our farmhouse headquarters on all sides, and the Jet team operators sent an urgent appeal to London for planes. In less than 2 hours, 35 fighter bombers appeared in response to this appeal. So wow, they're actually calling in like close air support type stuff, bombing and strapping enemy lines. It was an action better calculated to raise morale than help strategically. However, the German advance was held up, but they holed in and set it out until the planes were through. Then they resumed the advance. They were not within 400 years of our main force defending the supplies at headquarters, and they had completely sealed off the area. An inferno broke out, according to the captain. All equipment, including field guns, was brought to bear on the Nazis. In the next hour and a half, 700 Marquis were wiped out. The Nazis fought like maniacs, says the captain, but at nightfall they were still 400 yards from the headquarters. That night, the leaders reviewed the situation. They were defending an immense amount of supplies, including 5 tons of high explosive. It was worth fighting for, but it was equally apparent that the Nazis were determined to wipe out the sector. It was decided to abandon the supplies. The captain pointed out that the FFI, the Free French of the Interior, were not holding troops, functioning at their best in hit and runs. This was a factor which determined that their decision to fight their way out. The jet team packed their emergency kits for escape. The explosives and supplies were piled together and wired for explosion so that nothing of value would fall into enemy hands. The SAS and JED teams were divided into groups of 5 men and a rendezvous arranged in another area for the leaders. In the early morning now, and the breakthrough was to be made by truck, but according to Sear, there was considerable trouble in loading the truck. Everybody fighting to get on, and before serious trouble could start, the captain ordered his team to fight it out on foot. They left for the front lines, and with them went a group of British visitors who had been forced down and were attempting to get back to England, and an English staff officer. There, where he came from, the captain never found out. Things were like that in this terrified moment, says the captain. Incidentally, the captain paid tribute to his compass training at the time, had to take in azimuth reading on the prearranged rendezvous, and then march on the azimuth to the destination with many deviations and detours. Bit by bit, the party edged its way out of the firing zone and through the enemy line. Extreme tenseness led to the men firing at anything that moved, friend or foe, cows or horses. They rested in a wheat field, digging in frantically when they saw white Russian Cossacks beating the neighboring field. They evaded the Cossacks and, after several hours of alternately running and digging in, achieved their destination. They had their first meal in a safe house, only to be interrupted by one of our parachutists who warned that the Nazis had picked up the trail and were in the vicinity looking for the party. The old lady, who with her husband ran the farm, guided them to the river. The old man, a less hardy character, remained behind to clean up evidences of our occupation. According to Sear, the old lady, about 45, not only showed the way along the river and urged the team to follow it, but at a later rendezvous even swam across the river to put them on the right track and hide them in an old mill. 10 miles away, a tremendous explosion shook them up. It was the arsenal at headquarters. Apparently, the Nazis wiped out the sector but never reached the supplies. The old lady knew the ground and guided them safely out of danger. They had to skirt the area in a wide circle because remnants of our original force of 5,000 were still fighting. It was exhausting work, and the captain recalls that they were taking benzodine every 6 hours, or benzos every 6 hours, which worked fine except for the letdown when the effects were off. And still, the Germans, frequently using vicious dogs, kept picking up their trail. Heading south, the party was forced at one time to hide out 5 days and nights in a charcoal cellar. During all this period, they didn't know if it was daylight or dark, whether the footsteps they overheard were friend or foe. All they knew for certain was that they were closely pursued by an inexorable, I always butcher this word, inexorable enemy bent on wiping them out. They left the cellar and headed south, passing from hand to hand. From one farmer, days later, they learned that the Gestapo had found parachute equipment in one of the houses they had used for refuge. The Gestapo had dealt out their customary punishment to the family. The father's head was cut off, the mother was sexually assaulted and tortured, the children were killed. Once the party passed through a village, um, too late they spotted a German patrol at the end of one street. They were in nondescript uniform and bold as brass walked right past the patrol, reached the corner, ran like hell. Wow. They continually ran into white Russian patrols, and for sheer cruelty, the captain believes these troops surpassed even the Gestapo. They had a habit of riding into a village and shooting it up indiscriminately. They caught one of the marquee girl couriers, roped her to a saddle, and dragged her through the village until she was dead. All this, the captain believes, was to take out some of their chagrin at failing to capture the jet team. All contact with the liaison was lost. The team plodded south, grateful to keep one step ahead of capture. They planned to organize in the department the Lior Inferior. Wow. Whew. This is actually a book, No Moon as Witness Missions of the SOE and OSS in World War II by James Stechgall. So, with that being said, pretty exciting stuff. I'm just going to kind of pause right now and be back. All right, thanks. All right, so because this video is getting a little bit long, so I think we're pretty much squared away here. So a lot of the background, amazing World War II history of Paul Sear. So in the next video, I'm going to do a little bit more on Paul Sear, but then just kind of more summary notes, but then also the connection potentially with Lucien Cognier. So that's pretty much it for now. So thank you, and catch you next time. All right, peace.